You probably saw more than one person tell you about the rule of thirds. You decide to try it out and yeah, this photo looks better. That was easy. You research a bit more and you realize there are actually quite a lot of rules. And somehow now there is math involved. And then you start wondering, do you have to memorize all of this? Rule of thirds, golden spiral, leading lines, center the eyes, balance the weight, use negative space. It's a lot. But trying to understand this before taking photos is like trying to understand the laws of gravity before going for a walk. So instead of just listing you a bunch of composition rules, I thought I'd rather give you some advice on how to think about your composition. Understand how we see. As a photographer, you should always try to think about how your photo will be seen, how other people will perceive it. And for that, it's useful to know what calls for our attention. Scientifically, there are about 4 things that we always call for the attention of the human eye. The brightest spot in the image, the most saturated color, the area with the highest contrast, and lastly, human faces. With this, you should make sure that what you want to be important in your photo actually is. All of which leads me to my next tip. Decide what is important. Most visual arts are additive in nature. You draw something, then you draw another thing, and then you have an image. But photography doesn't work quite like that. Unless you are in a control scenario where you have control of the lights and you have money to put whatever you want, you're usually working in a subtractive manner. You're choosing what goes out of the frame. And even this light change on the camera's position may drastically change the photo. Of course, there's the obvious, try not to cut people's heads. I think it's also important to be aware of distracting elements in the edges of the frame. They sometimes can take away the eyes from the focus of the image. But what is the focus of the image in the first place? You may have a subject, you may know what you're shooting, but how much more do you need to get the photo? Maybe your subject alone is enough to make a photo. Or maybe you want more context, you want a counterbalance to your subject. Or even maybe you want the subject in its surroundings. Maybe the relation between the two is what's interesting. Luck goes only so far. Don't expect to always be in the right place at the right time. Sometimes it may happen, but in reality, one of the photographer's most important skills is trying to see a photo before it happens. It's what Henri Cartier-Bresson coined as the decisive moment. That split second where everything comes together. For that, some things may help. Scout the location. Know your subject and its behavior. Understand how light changes. You can use apps like Sunseeker, for example, to understand how the sun moves across the day. And also, be quick. Some photos just go and vanish, like this. But that comes from practice. And that comes from shooting often and failing often. And failing often, you learn often. And that makes it so when the moment finally arrives, it's just instinct. But don't forget, patience is key. Maybe you find a photo that could be good, but something is missing. And so you wait for the right moment where the right cyclist passes right where you want. In other words, you make your own luck. Think like a painter. I know this might seem obvious, but we live in a 3D world. And since we have 2 eyes, we are very used to understanding depth, perspective, and filtering out distracting elements. But photography doesn't work quite like that. Essentially, what you're doing is compressing this 3D world around us into a 2D slate. Which means that the position of your camera and the position of the subject, as well as the position of the elements around it, will completely change how a photo looks. So, when hunting for a composition, don't just settle for eye level, try to lay down. Maybe you can find a really good shot from down there. Or maybe get some stairs, shoot from above, who knows? You can also think in terms of layers. Changing the position of your camera, you can add a foreground to your photo, for example. And you can change even more the position of your camera and get a completely new background. So, what I'm trying to say here is that as a photographer, position itself, in a sense, is your brush. Get your lenses right. And by that, I don't necessarily mean how open or close your shot is. After all, you can use a 24mm for an open shot, but also for a close-up. The best way to visualize this is with a dolly zoom. The composition does not change, only the focal lengths. And so, when thinking of which lens to use, you should rather think more about the relation of the subject with its background. Do you want the subject to feel in a wide open space? Or maybe you wanted to feel more removed, you want the subject far away from the viewer. Even the distortion of a fisheye lens might be what's right for your photo. Your phone is your friend. This is one of the best things you can use when taking photos, and not necessarily to take photos with it. What I mean is, you can use this as a viewfinder. You have a bunch of apps for Canon, for Nikon, for Sony, where you can simulate a camera and know at which position and with which lens you'd have to be to get the shot you want, like this one, for example. So, especially if you're using fixed lenses, this thing is a way faster and more nimble way to hunt for compositions. Shoot like the blind. Okay, I know this sounds weird, but bear with me. Here's some story time. I usually work on film sets, and once I met this director of photography where every time she would compose a new shot, she would take her glasses out, which I found pretty weird. And she told me that the blurriness actually helps her compose. And it actually does, because we are very used to seeing the world in detail, but once you take it out, you can understand certain things. For example, you can see the general shapes of the things in an image. You can see where the brightest spot in the image is. You can see where the most saturated color is. And with those, you can understand it better and thus have a more balanced shot. Don't forget the why. And I do think this is the most important tip. When taking photos, especially at the beginning, it's very easy to get a bit lost in the whole technicality of things, of trying to get a photo right. And while it's important to get good at the technical side, it isn't everything. There's much more to photography than a pretty and an ugly photo. When you position a camera somewhere, you are always choosing a point of view. And that comes with who you are. You are bringing with you all your preconceptions. Sebastião Salgado used to say that you shoot with your culture. And it's true. You cannot disassociate your photos from yourself. So when taking a photo, more than is this photo ugly, is this photo pretty, think about what are you trying to pass on? What feelings are you trying to pass? What ideas are you trying to pass? And I do think this counts way more. At the end of the day, when you think of photos that you liked, they stuck with you for a reason. And these are the reasons that make photos special in the first place.